Good evening, everyone. I'm Laura Sparks, president of the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art, and it is my privilege to welcome you to the Great Hall this evening for the 2024 Benjamin Menschel Distinguished Lecture. For nearly 165 years, the Cooper Union has been a New York City destination for influential and everyday voices to address the critical issues of the day. This institution was founded on the belief that making education accessible to all and fostering reasoned dialogue is instrumental to sustaining democracy. And because of that commitment, American history has taken shape right here in this room. From President Lincoln's avowal that right makes might to countless other impassioned pleas, debates, and discussions, many of them strongly divided, and many of them uncomfortable. Throughout that history, discomfort has never been a reason to shut down discourse or to disengage from others' point of view. On the contrary, as we'll hear tonight, discomfort is necessary. It's a necessary part of embracing our democratic agency. All of us are grappling with complex challenges to public life in an age when, alongside deep conflicts, we are becoming increasingly quick to react, to dehumanize, and to turn away from our differences. We urgently need to rediscover spaces where courageous, informed citizens can come together. Today, the Cooper Union is carrying that American legacy forward through opportunities like this evening and educating the future leaders not only of architecture, art, and engineering, but of our society. Those of you familiar with Cooper know that the Benjamin Menschel Distinguished Lecture Series is an important and special part of our work. This endowed lecture series hosts influential writers, civic leaders, scientists, and humanitarians to this storied stage. Previous lectures have included surgeon and public health expert Dr. Atul Gawande, jazz legend Wynton Marsalis, and professor, historian, and filmmaker Henry Louis Gates. All of this made possible through the generosity of the Menschel family and the Horace W. Goldsmith Foundation. The Menschels are longtime benefactors and dear friends of Cooper who believe deeply in the work and experiences of our students, our faculty, and our broader community. Their exceptional support and dedication over the years has brought important civic discourse to this stage and funded unique educational opportunities, including the annual Benjamin Menschel Fellowship Program to support creative inquiry and our Benjamin Menschel Civic Projects Lab. My deepest thanks to the Menschel family. We are so grateful for all that they have done for this institution. Since 2000, the Menschel Lecture Series has taken place in this historic Great Hall where, as you saw in the opening video, generations of changemakers, activists, and civic leaders have explored the promise and potential of American democracy. We are deeply honored this evening to be adding Darren Walker to the Great Hall legacy. Darren is an acclaimed philanthropy leader and has been for more than 20 years. He serves today as the 10th president of the Ford Foundation, which centers philanthropic initiatives on the front lines of social change around the globe. Darren speaks often and eloquently about his upbringing in a small town in Texas and how it informs his view to this day on the promise of America. Tonight, he'll share his perspective on that promise and on our shared duty to steward it, to advance social progress for a more just and a more equitable world. Joining Darren Walker in conversation after his talk is New York editor and Pulitzer Prize-winning author David Remnick. We are so grateful to have these two luminaries with us tonight. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Darren Walker.
Good evening, good evening. And thank you, Laura, for that very kind introduction, and congratulations to you as the leader of the Cooper Union. For 7+ years now, you have been at the helm of this remarkable unusual, and critically important treasure in the firmament of higher education in our nation. Thank you for your leadership. I'm certainly honored to be here and grateful, of course, to the Menschels and the Horace W. Goldsmith Foundation for bringing this lecture, making it possible in honor of Richard's father, Benjamin Menschel. I also want to thank my friend David Remnick for lending his wisdom and perspicacity for tonight's program. So for some 165 years, this great hall has served as a great American crossroads, an intersection of people and ideas, an intersection of past and present and future. For generations, this is where we collectively hold up history's compass to orient and reorient ourselves, to find a way forward. And I must confess that I feel a little overwhelmed with awe and humility as I reflect on my moment at this podium, on our moment together this evening, to imagine what Abraham Lincoln might have observed from this vantage, what Frederick Douglass might have discerned looking out at the audience from this dais, what Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton might have beheld, to see in your faces the faces of our forebearers who could not know how history would unfold, to see in our great city on edge, their great city on edge, and our great republic on the brink, their great republic on the brink. At every consequential juncture, this great hall is where we, the people, come together to deliberate, to debate, to decide. And for us, as for those who came before us, we are staring straight, unavoidably, into a crossroads of our own, into a hard set of choices. These choices are choices about what kind of nation we will be, what kind of nation we are, about what kind of leaders we will be, what kind of citizens will we be. We have choices before us today, choices between hope and fear, between courage and despair, between one worldview that tells us might makes right, and another that insists, as Lincoln affirmed for the ages in this great hall, that right makes might, that our shared values, our democratic values, remain our greatest strength. Now, these days, it is so easy. One might reasonably wonder whether America's many multitudes are even reading the same compass. We are pulled hither and yon in so many directions. Up is down, backward is forward. Tonight, though, I would propose that we still do share what Frederick Douglass called true north, a set of ideas, aspirations, enshrined in Thomas Jefferson's Declaration, to which Lincoln appealed time and again during the tumultuous, transformative years that followed his visit here. We all are created equal. We all are endowed with inalienable rights. Our American identity emerges not from blood and soil, but from fidelity to these truths we hold self-evident even still. out of many, we are one. We believe in equal representation, equal rights, and equal justice, in what Douglas called absolute equality. We believe in freedom with fairness, in free expression, free exercise, and we believe in a free press. We believe in our moral responsibilities, in empathy. We believe in generosity. We believe in liberty and justice, and in striking the balance between the two, between the rights of the individual and our responsibilities to the collective. Now, there are many, many in this country who say that these are hollow words at best. And the facts are undeniable. If we're to be honest with ourselves, it's a fact that America has functioned as a full democracy for less than one human lifetime. And when you think about it, our democracy is only as old as I am. I was born in 1959 into a nation riven by American apartheid. When I was a child, the adults in my life, in the small towns in Louisiana and Texas where I grew up, could not vote. I was 6 years old when President Johnson enacted legislation to guarantee the franchise for all Americans. And even these protections are imperiled now, as so many of our fundamental rights are. And yet, for my part, I believe that our American compass is still true. I see flawed genius in our founders and their legacy, and in Lincoln's determination to preserve that legacy at all costs. To me, the contradiction, the hypocrisy of our founders is less remarkable than what they set in motion. They initiated a grand, complicated experiment in self-government that has existed nowhere throughout history. That experiment led to abolition and suffrage and workers' rights and civil rights and women's rights, however slowly, however unevenly. More astounding still, generation by generation, Black people and brown people, the indigenous and the immigrant, Jews and Muslims, queer people and people with disabilities, we all claimed the American project as our birthright. We have expanded the circle of inclusion and opportunity, making real the American promise, step by step, crossroads by crossroads, now 250 years on. Jefferson and the others passed to us something unprecedented, something radical. That true compass, the tools, the very tools with which to navigate our course toward a multiracial, multi-ethnic, pluralist democracy that extends the privilege of American identity to all. I love my country. I am grateful to this country, and I am very proud. We should all be proud. But I am worried about my country. I am worried that I sense a level of nihilism has taken hold across this country. We are tearing each other down, tearing ourselves apart at the seams and tearing our nation asunder. I feel that America is more irreparably divided than ever before in my lifetime. We may well be barreling down a parallel path to the one that Lincoln and his contemporaries traveled in the 1850s. The sustainability, the durability, the very survival of our democratic republic is in jeopardy. And what is different today are the trends that have converged and brought us to this moment. A primary current carving a great chasm across our land, across our nation, our soul, is inequality. Inequality in access and agency, in resources and respect, in voice and value. Inequalities of all kinds and categories, in part the consequence of a market system that is wildly out of balance. And so before you presume where I'm taking this conversation, let me say that I am a proud capitalist. I believe in the market system's unique power to lift lives and livelihoods when abetted by public policy that ensures the market is fair and inclusive. But in a democratic capitalist society, democracy must come first, or the whole enterprise collapses. Today, for too many Americans of every color and creed in red states and blue states, the mobility escalator that I got on has sputtered to a stop. Millions live on the brink with less than a few $100s of savings. Their lives defined by trauma, by pain, by an inescapable and insidious hopelessness. And hope, my friends, hope is the oxygen of democracy. The poet asks, what happens to a dream deferred? Well, what happens to the American dream betrayed? One can understand why so many people respond to a world that feels completely out of control, a world turned completely against them with fear, with resentment, with grievance, and with vitriol. And we have to also acknowledge how the forces of narrow self-interest in our society exploit these disaffected and disillusioned people, preying on them for their own gain with impunity. One can see also how our broken for-profit media system aggravates our inequality crisis. If America's founders agreed on anything, it was that democracy would depend on a free and fact-based press. And that through enlightenment, as Jefferson said, and I quote, tyranny will vanish like evil spirits at the dawn of day. Of course, what we see today is something very different. What we see is that many media companies' business models produce exactly the opposite. Audiences respond to the most prurient and pernicious content. So the content and programming algorithms deliver hour after hour of it, monetizing the degradation of our democracy. In some media, we see hate and hostility, misinformation and disinformation, sometimes outright falsehoods fed into the bloodstream of the body politic. And online, the most obnoxious, odious voices garner the most clicks and likes and shares. Truth be damned, training the algorithms to feed us ever-increasing doses of poison. Now, this formula may provide a very healthy return on capital, but it does so at the cost of an information cancer now metastasizing throughout our democracy. And then into the torrent converges another destabilizing, defining trend too. We are mired in a culture of absolutism. If I asked you to encapsulate the last decade of American life in a single word, a few possibilities might be offered. Aberrant, abhorrent, I might suggest another, extreme. Everything right now, it seems, is black or white, all or nothing, perfect or unacceptable. Every venue, it seems, has become a theater for affirming our own virtue or righteousness, or for denying someone else's. The purpose of the public square has become completely distorted and perverted. Only a generation ago, we used the commons as the infrastructure through which to negotiate diversity and difference, to find common ground, sometimes more effectively than others. But now we treat the public square as merely another platform on which to perform, to take a side, to prove our piety. I have a question. Who killed nuance? Nuance and complexity seem to be nowhere to be found. In their place is a pervasive, paralyzing cynicism. And so, our extreme challenges remain extremely unsolved. We've normalized mendacity and malice, bizarrely enough, even among those with whom we mostly agree. And what about those with whom we disagree? We shame, we cancel, we dehumanize, we demonize. As Americans, I am sorry to say, we are increasingly intolerant of each other. We are increasingly intolerant, period. Lincoln's admonition, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," feels truer, realer, rawer than ever. And so, we must decide what matters most. The America we love, the America we are at our best, the democratic values to which we aspire, or the self-satisfaction of our self-certainty and the self-destruction that follows. So what are we to do in this moment? At this hour of choosing, what are we to decide? Well, for starters, let's choose to lead. And let's choose to make it easier, not so painfully difficult, for those who sign up to lead, and to lead with courage and bravery and tell the truth. Effective leadership, moral leadership, demands that we listen with more humility, more curiosity, and more empathy. And even if we don't agree with 100% of what we assume we are hearing, we need to listen. It requires that we build longer bridges among communities that look, speak, work, worship, or vote differently than we do. And it challenges us to recognize that within all of this rolling crisis, there is opportunity if we are brave enough to seize it. We, all of us, have made it too difficult for good leaders to do the work of holding up that compass and finding the way out and the way through. We are discouraging courage. There has never been a time more difficult to lead an institution in this country, a university. Think about being a public school teacher and leading a classroom, a principal of a school, the leader of a nonprofit, the leader of a public company. Never has it been harder to be a leader in America at a time when America has never needed leadership more. Sadly, the prevailing attitude among many leaders in this country today is to just keep their heads down. They're told by their boards, by their stakeholders, by their shareholders, by their donors, protect yourself and our reputation. Don't speak out. Don't say anything that might be potentially controversial. We have to reject this way of operating. What's the point of calling ourselves leaders if we're afraid to actually lead? I certainly don't claim any special access to morality or to moral principles. I do believe, however, that we need more leaders focused on something greater than the next earnings call or living in fear of the next reporter to call. We need new profiles and courage, leaders who recognize that bringing light is always worth the heat. We also need leaders who have a moral compass and the courage to embrace the nuance and complexity to which we've become allergic. Indeed, the very definition of effective leadership is managing nuance, managing complexity, seeing all sides of an issue from the perspectives of many stakeholders, and then setting a course, communicating with clarity, consistent with a core set of values. Now, this is true in government or business, civil society, and nonprofits alike, but it is not easy. We struggle with this in reconciling with and rectifying our past. We struggle with this in the present, given the pain and grief and despair of this moment, given widening deficits of trust and empathy and faith in our shared humanity, and given the inequality that desensitizes us to the suffering and pain and anguish of others, preventing us from joining together in common cause to solve shared challenges. And yet we know the road to reconciliation, to shared healing and shared hope runs through precisely these things: trust and empathy, faith in each other, grace and love for each other, and collective action for the common good. And progress down that road requires that we rediscover and recommit ourselves to our shared American identity. From my own journey, I understand how and how much our identities matter. I understand how our intersecting identities too often determine what doors are open to us and what doors are closed. And yet, for more than 6 decades on this earth, I believe that none of my identities matters more than my American identity. And the truth is, I've lived on both sides of the identity equation in America. I've lived on both sides of the inequality in this country. I grew up Black in the lost cause Jim Crow South. In college, I had suite mates, dorm mates, who proudly hung Confederate flags on their dorm walls, who attended fraternity parties in their Confederate grays. And yet, throughout my life, I have benefited in ways visible and invisible from Americans, Black and white, who challenged our nation to fulfill its promise. And I certainly grew up poor as the son of a single mother. And yet, throughout my life, I benefited from the American people's investment in the dreams of little boys and girls in small towns in places like Texas and Louisiana. Investments in Head Start and public schools and Pell Grants, which made my education possible. And of course, I grew up gay at a time when people saw my sexuality as a psychological disorder or even a crime. And yet, throughout my life, I have seen Americans choose the higher road. Now, I'm not denying that I don't feel enraged, exhausted, depressed, and dejected by some of the things I see around me. And I worry deeply that the ubiquitous sense of unfairness that has consumed so many of us will take us off course. Too many people sense that others are gaining an advantage or an edge while they are falling behind. And no doubt by good fortune, I have in this system in this country, this system has made me a winner. It has lifted me out of poverty and given me the opportunities to realize my dreams. Yet too many people feel that this system, this same system, is working against them, that it is rigged against them. So I worry deeply about the rage that tears away at our patriotism. We cannot allow this kind of anger to fester, and we cannot surrender our patriotism, neither our love of country nor the idea of service to our country. Because the only way to ensure America works for everyone is for everyone to put in the work for America. And not just giving back, being prepared, particularly for those of us who are privileged, not just to give back, but be prepared to give up some of that privilege. Which brings us back to that snowy evening 164 years ago, when a lanky young Illinois congressman stepped onto this very stage in his wrinkled suit. At that moment, Lincoln's opponents were demanding that the federal government permit slavery spread to the West. But more than that, they were threatening to destroy the republic itself, unless, as Lincoln said here, they be allowed to rule or ruin as they pleased, without regard to the Constitution. This kind of all or nothing government, this kind of asymmetrical autocracy may sound familiar. We hear the echoes almost daily, but what Lincoln wisely knew then, and what we would be well served to remember now, was that democracy is not a permanent condition. He knew that the only way to protect democracy, to preserve democracy, is through the give and take, through the slow, sometimes frustrating, consensus-building machinery that our founders engineered. In a word, through compromise. After all, if we lose our ability to disagree without destroying one another, then everything is jeopardized. Everything is imperiled. Because where compromise ends, where the basic values of tolerance ends, this is where violence begins. For too long, we have accepted the zero-sum thinking that says, if the other side wins anything, my side loses on everything. And yes, it is very true that compromise is often undesirable, it can be frustrating, and it can be distasteful. And worse, it can perpetuate the very harm that we most fervently want to heal. But the work of justice is much bigger than any one compromise. It is the work of a lifetime, the work of generations, the work of the American project itself. And so together, at this time of choosing, let us recommit ourselves to the grandest project of all, the American experiment, the American idea. Let's step away from the extremes and from the edge, away from the sanctimony and certitude. Here in this great hall, at this profound crossroads for our democracy, let's hold up history's compass and take measure of the road we've traveled, of the journey ahead. There is no map because there never was a map. But with leadership, with open minds and open hearts, with vigilance, with hope, we can and we will find our way back to true north together. Thank you so very much for this opportunity.
Well, that was extraordinary, Darren, and yes, absolutely. But you're not finished yet. So this speech takes place in a time, in a place, specifically a few days after a poll was published in the New York Times, telling us that, and I'll be specific in a way that was implied, that Donald Trump is leading the presidential race now by several points. And you didn't mention his name, I think completely by design, but you also said, and you quoted Frederick Douglass, that we all share a true north, that we all share a set of principles, a devotion to equality and fairness and much else. How to reconcile at this time, at this place, in 2024, as we approach the spring, just months away from this presidential race, which is so consequential, your remarks about a true north being shared by all of us and the cold facts of what we're facing now?
Well, I believe that we are, as a nation, and so many of the people in this country feel so disaffected and disillusioned. Part of that disillusionment and disaffection comes from their own experience of what America, this country, is supposed to provide them. And if you look at the data, that disaffection is in part economic. They see that, I'm talking about working class. Well, let's talk first about working class white Americans who believe that they have played by the rules and that they are falling farther and farther behind. And they're right. They're absolutely right. Their anger may be directed in the wrong direction, but their sense of disillusionment and disappointment is legitimate. And I don't think it's fair, as some have said, that the supporters of people like Donald Trump are all racist. They're not all racist. Donald Trump got 13% of Barack Obama's votes. So yes, there are absolutely the people who denied that President Obama was an American. I mean, the whole that whole community absolutely were racist. But that doesn't explain what is happening, because there's something more fundamentally happening in this country. And if you travel the country, which I do in my work, the great privilege of leading forward, you see it. You see how people feel like they are living on the edge economically. There are parts of this country, rural parts of this country, where people are walking around the streets the way we see in San Francisco and other places, completely drugged out. Completely drugged out. Like in a small town with like one red light flashing. And part of that is a sense of people feeling that things are completely out of control. And the response to that is what we're getting, is what we're seeing. Now that's economic. There's also cultural, right? So some of those same working class whites have an expectation that America is supposed to deliver for them. And for the first time in American history, we have a generation of downwardly mobile white Americans. And that is absolutely something that we are seeing. We also are seeing what happens from the economic stress of people feeling left out and left behind and needing to find, again, as we have seen throughout history, find scapegoats for why they are in the situation they are in. And so while we have a true north, that true north is fairness, is equality. It is from where we sit. And where we sit is a different place. And so our interpretation of what is fair, what we deserve, what we are entitled to, depends.
This was a very optimistic speech in a sense, and it was a speech, although it never used the word that I remember, but it seemed to be a speech as defense of liberalism as such, and not revolution. You even said at one point you're proudly pro-capitalist. My guess is if you were in classrooms at Cooper Union or NYU down the street or anywhere else in the city, you'd get a lot of arguments about that. Do you feel that we live in a moment of liberal reassessment or even revolutionary times?
Absolutely, and liberalism should be reassessed. I mean, again, the liberal economic policies have not served working people. So I'm not, people like us, we're winners in this system. This system, we don't have to do it. I mean,
for sure,
we just work, and we don't have to do anything but work. And we are so disconnected from the lived experience of most Americans. And so when we talk about liberalism and illiberalism, it's one thing to talk about liberalism from the standpoint of sort of political science, the sort of policy around governance, authoritarianism, and these things. But when we talk about liberalism from an economic standpoint, I have a real problem. And I know that I speak on college campuses, and the Pew data are very clear. Something upwards of 40% of young people do not believe capitalism is the best way to organize an economic system. And why should they? If what capitalism is to them, the private bank that owns their student loan, I mean, first of all, what's a private bank doing owning their student loan? Is that capitalism?
One could ask why there are student loans, but that's another
Exactly.
matter. Yeah.
One could ask why there are student loans. This is exactly right. Why are there student loans? I mean, I believe there are things in a democracy that are a right, and education is one of them.
Darren, we've talked about this in private before, but I thought maybe we'd bring it out and take it on the road. I have a newsroom full of very young copy editors and fact checkers, and the range of writers and age is more various, but it amounts to a sizable, whatever we are, institution. You have a much larger one, and we know, for example, in 1967 or 8, if you were in jobs like ours and you were people like us, and you were, say, teaching English at Columbia, and you were against the Vietnam War, and you had on your syllabus Ralph Ellison as well as William Faulkner, and you were for proto-feminism, and you thought you were for the program, and then the next thing you know, your students have taken over your office, and they're smoking all your cigars, and apparently your sideburns didn't mean shit. You mentioned how difficult it is to be a leader of an institution. Tell me a little bit about that in some concrete detail, and how one should how one handles it poorly and how one handles it well.
It's hard to be a leader because so many of the problems that require solutions require engaging in nuance and explaining that the response to your grievance is not a simple response. And I think often it is hard for leaders when faced with stakeholders who have righteous grievance, who are angry or who are dissatisfied for legitimate reasons, to acknowledge the legitimacy of that anger, that disillusionment, but to be able to talk about how to manage through that. And so very specifically, that is situations like returning to work, right? I mean, you know, I've had major drama at the Ford Foundation around returning to work after COVID. I'm old school. I mean, to me, you should be in the office.
On the question of leadership,
that's not the way.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, and that's not, and part of the challenge was, as a leader, how do you listen, right? And how do you change your mind? Because I changed my mind about this as I came to understand how younger people, and how, not just younger people, lots of people, see work, and where work ought to fit in their life, their lifestyles, their livelihoods.
When you watch the spectacle of a congressional hearing with Representative Stefanik and college presidents faced with the questions and the questioning that they did, I think this goes to your point here about cancellation and nuance and the rest. How do you look at something like that, and how should we understand something like that? Because it seemed part and parcel of what you were trying to get at.
Well, I mean, I think a congressional hearing is theater. I mean, it's not a substantive often. I mean, it's theater. And going into it, you have to understand that you have been cast in somebody else's production. And often, as a leader, we walk into rooms that are hostile, and we have been cast. I have been cast as the black queer man. You have been cast as the Jewish editor of The New Yorker.
Mm-hmm. Talking dog cartoons and whatnot.
Right. I mean,
inside of a piece about the Middle East.
We are cast.
Yeah.
I mean, and so as leaders, we have to understand the room we're walking into, the context that we are in, and know that there are people who, particularly if we bring a perspective, as I do, around social justice, who will seek to undermine us because what we represent is a threat. And so you have to be prepared as a leader to engage in that. And one of the really hard things to do for leaders is to have because we have bosses, and our bosses are called boards of directors. And boards of directors often are not people who want to be mired in controversy. And boards of directors often are giving the directives, keep your head down.
Talk to me a little bit about that. I think this is I didn't think I lived in a world until a few years ago where CEOs were duty-bound to issue political proclamations about one issue or another. Now, lots of them are, and a lot of those statements are tortured or insufficient or unsatisfactory.
Because they're inauthentic.
They're ridiculous. And what should a CEO do?
Well, I mean, I think this is one of the really hard things that we know about leadership, right? That we know from research and survey data, from employees, from faculty, from stakeholders, that the most effective leaders are perceived as authentic. And one of the reasons there are trust gaps is because stakeholders don't often believe their leaders are who they present themselves to be. And so one of the really hard things is for a leader to be truly authentic. I mean, it happens to me all the time, as you know. I mean, because sometimes I won't agree with something that is reasonable and that many people I know or that many of my own staff believe is reasonable. And I won't sign off on it. I won't sign on to it. And it gets me in trouble. I mean, look, you remember when I didn't sign the Prison Abolition Manifesto. Mm-hmm. You remember the protests?
I do.
In front of my apartment.
I do.
And it was really difficult.
Did you regret it?
I absolutely didn't regret it. As I said at the town hall to the Ford staff, I was sorry that I disappointed some of those staff who felt I should sign it. But I did not regret my decision. And that's authentically who I am. I'm often a reformer. I'm not often an abolition, where I'm like, just abolish it. And that doesn't always sit well. And that's okay. I get heckled, you have people, who let you know.
And
which is what happens when you're supposed to be leading.
Darren, you talk about it rather freely and in this speech as well, so I don't feel reluctant to ask you. But it seems to me that your own journey is an extraordinary complex one. You referred to your growing up in Texas and Louisiana, the racism you've experienced, the bigotry you've experienced as a gay man. You have known extremely difficult economic circumstances, and in New York, you are fluid in and with anybody, both in your work and in your friendships, and it's quite extraordinary. But I also imagine at times it's difficult. It's complex in the same way that Barack Obama, as a political figure, presented his own identities as both a virtue, but there were also immense complexities to it. And I wish you could talk a little bit about that vis-a-vis what you've remarked on tonight.
Well, I believe, I think the most challenging part of the complexity is that I live in a world of a lot of privilege. But I remain connected, and this is partly how I think, my head on straight. I'm still connected to my family in those small towns in Louisiana. I still get the calls when Uncle Buster dies and Aunt Penny doesn't have the money to bury him, and we've got to all I mean, I got a black family back at home. And they help me keep it real. And so when I am sitting at a dinner party in Southampton, and I am saying to a group of people, talking about who were responding favorably to a Times op-ed I wrote, I asked the table, all right, here's what I meant when I said we privileged people sitting around this table, it's not just about giving back. We should be prepared to give up something.
So elaborate on that point.
Well, here's an example. I said, I'm looking around this table.
Who at that table is giving up anything?
Many of you at this table, you went to Ivy League schools. How many of you are prepared to abolish legacy admissions?
And?
No,
And?
nobody. And what was also interesting was, I have to go there too. There were 3 black people at the table who went to Ivy League schools, and they were the most vociferous about not giving it up. And partly because, as one of them said, we're the first generation to have this privilege, and now you want to take it away. My retort to my friend who said that was, I am not worried about your daughter at Brearley. I am worried about who that girl, that young woman is in that same town down south going to a public school like your sister did. So how we talk about privilege, how we engage in it, and it is difficult because when you're wealthy in this country and you're privileged, and this is, so the hardest part for me, David, is like engaging in this with people, right? As I said, you just show up. When I learned this, when I was a student, when I came to New York and I went to the law firm, and the woman who took care of all the young associates said, oh, take this brown envelope and take it to First City National. That just shows how old I am. At 55.
I thought you were a messenger.
No. At 55 Wall Street, which now, of course, is Cipriani. I am so old. So I go there, and I'm standing in the line. It's the middle of the summer. It's hot. I'm standing in line, and this woman sees me, and she's walking, and I'm standing in the line with lots of people, and I said, oh, ma'am, I'm to give you this. And so she looked at it, and she opens it, and she says, oh, sir, you're in the wrong line. And I was like, okay. And she says, please come with me. And so she takes me up these stairs into another part of the bank, and there was a sign, and it said, the private bank. Now, I thought a bank was a bank. I didn't know there was something called a private bank. And so when I went in and she sat me down with like a person at a desk, not like a bank teller. I mean, the only banking I had ever done was at the Student Credit Union at the University of Texas. So and they explained to me that in the private bank, your checks don't bounce. I mean, I grew up, my mother, every paycheck was like rushing to the bank to make sure her checks did. I mean, like I remember rushing to put her salary, and all of a sudden I have someone say, well, your checks don't bounce. And we'll call you to give you, and I was just shocked. But that's what a private bank, it is a metaphor. And when I say this to people who are privileged, part of the challenge is to get them to understand how harmful it can be to have 2 lanes, 2 lines in this country, and how Michael Sandel's work at Harvard, who has demonstrated, the whole myth of meritocracy, the ways in which privilege manifests, is so important. And sometimes that's a tough conversation, because the whole point of privilege is to insulate yourself from the vicissitudes of the way most people have to live their lives.
And to perpetuate it.
Well, and to perpetuate it, which is why, And I appreciate parents who worked hard or who grew up working class and say, I don't want my kids to have to worry about the things that I worried about. Okay, you want them to have privilege. I understand that. But when there is so much hoarding of privilege, and so many people feel left out and feel that the very system that is generating our privilege is generating their disadvantage, we get what we got in this country.
You talk very eloquently about leadership, the need for leadership, the need for moral leadership, and the road out of dehumanization of each other. Where do you find examples of that kind of leadership in your life, in your work, in just looking around?
Well, let's first understand that there are a lot of people in pain. And one of the responses when you're in pain, when you're aggrieved, when someone has wronged you, is to not see their humanity. And we've seen that in moments of real anger. When the officers who killed George Floyd were sentenced, I was watching, I was riveted by it that day. It was very hard for me in the wake of that murder to see the humanity, because he killed a man in broad daylight. And so, he was I could not see his humanity. And it took me thinking about that to get to a place where when they showed the family members in the courtroom crying and upset or shocked or what, I had to see their humanity. They're human beings with feelings. And so as a leader, we have to be able to say that. We have to also be able to acknowledge that in this moment, the pain that you are experiencing, I understand if it's not possible for you to see the humanity, to be completely rational in this moment. But the role of leadership is to help people get there. Because if we can't see a shared humanity, then it is very hard to imagine how this society sustains itself.
Similarly, I remember covering in Charleston, South Carolina, the mass killing by Dylan Roof of all these folks in a basement Bible class. I forget how many were killed. It's terrible. 9, 10. It was just one of the worst things. And shortly after he was arrested, this kid was arrested, any number of relatives of the people who were killed were weeping and wishing mercy on the murderer. And I think some immense proportion of this country, frankly myself included, had a very, very hard time understanding how that was humanly possible.
I think those people, those working class black people at that church, had a value set that allowed them to see, even within hours of seeing their fellow parishioners murdered, they had a capacity to see that he was a human being and that something had gone wrong in his own sense of values. And I am, some of us who grow up in a black church, or as I did work in a black church for 8 years, there are values that you learn, and there are things that you see. I'm not advocating that everybody needs to join a black church to be able to see shared humanity, but I am saying that for the example you give is one where a set of values propel them to take the actions, to demonstrate passion and forgiveness. I'm simply saying if we have a value that says that we can empathize, we can see the humanity of the other. Look, it is, I'm a very, as you know, great advocate for the arts. And it is, we know from the research that the arts, among the things the arts do and exposure to the arts do, is develop empathy, develop an ability to engage with people who are not like you, and develop a sense of compassion. And whenever I see a leader who speaks of other human beings in dehumanizing, degrading, disgusting ways, you know that is a leader who has never read a beautiful Maya Angelou poem. He has never sat in front of a great painting and pondered its meaning. He has never been to a theater and had the experience of exhilaration that comes with great theater and the deepening of their own sense of spirit and soul. And so it's a plea for the arts. We need more of it in order to be the empathetic nation we must be.
Finally, Darren, in your own work, leading the Ford Foundation, it's actually a remarkable thing. Here is money that's made by the automotive industry and a family that, in its origins, was not exactly exemplary in its attitude toward.
So, David, my friend,
yeah. However,
we can establish as.
But let me finish my question. And you have turned it on its head, and this foundation is done exemplary work in social justice and in the arts. And I want to get a sense of what your goals are in your own personal work, in your daily work, to answer your own speech, because I think it's extraordinary and I think it deserves amplification.
You're very kind. I am very proud to have the privilege of serving this institution. I fully embrace our founder, who was unequivocally the greatest anti-Semite in the United States in the 20th century. That's not even debatable. He also was the first industrialist to name inequality as a problem. He was the first to increase, in fact, he doubled the salaries of his frontline workers, including the black workers. He was, in many ways, through his son, who really actually established the foundation, a metaphor for this country. There were so many things about Henry Ford that speak to our greatest aspirations as a people and as a nation. And there were also many things about him that were odious and appalling and deeply offensive. We could say that about a few men who gathered in Philadelphia. And the ability to be able to hold both of those truths, which I think is so hard to do. It is hard to embrace the idea that there can be multiple truths. We seem to only want one narrative. We seem to need to pick a side or have someone demand that we pick a side because there's only one truth. Thomas Jefferson was a rapist. He was this horrible, horrible person. Full stop, end of the story. Yes, he was. And he also was a genius. He also wrote a document that put in place the mechanisms to fix all the stuff he wasn't brave enough to do. But he did write the words. And sometimes I am criticized in a speech or in my annual letter once when I, in the same paragraph, referenced Jefferson's letter to his friend Samuel DuPont. And he said, the work of America is to build a just nation. He said those words. I want to hold Jefferson to those words. And so I'm going to use Jefferson. I'm not going to let others say, no, he's ours. He's ours, the racist, the rapist, I mean, all of those things, right. The genius, he's all of those things. That's our history. It's not one or the other. And it is very hard because we need in our society to find the perfect victims and the perfect oppressors. And there is neither. And in this case, there is neither. And we need to understand that that complexity, that nuance, is our lived experience. And living with that and not recoiling at it, for me, I think there is great irony in the fact that a black queer man is the president of the Ford Foundation. I think it is, I mean, I say that not snarkily, I say that in this, that we can evolve.
But how does that affect the work that you do every day?
The work that we do today, very briefly, Henry Ford left us a remit, in part, to strengthen democracy and democratic practice. That's in the charter. What are the threats to democracy? What are the threats to a strong democracy? Inequality is a threat because inequality generates hopelessness, and hopelessness is the enemy of democracy. And so if our mission from our donor is to strengthen democracy, we've got to fight the things that are harmful to democracy. Injustice, racism, all of the ways in which gender bias, the ways in which bias against LGBT and trans, how all of that happens in our society, all of that is a threat to democracy. And so our work supports those who are on the front lines doing that work. And that is very hard because it's a different kind of work than I worked at the Rockefeller Foundation where we worked on vaccines and seeds and soils. When you're working on those things, it's science. It accretes. If you're working on an antiretroviral to address HIV, every trial builds on the others. Even if if you're working on racial justice in America, if you're working on a right to abortion in America, you can be almost towards the finish line and find yourself right back in the starting blocks.
So it seems.
And that's why what we fund at the Ford Foundation are organizations, institutions who are doing that work over time. Last thing is the example I give. We funded the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in the early 1960s to sue the states of Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. In the 1960s, just to be clear. The last grant that we did when Cheryl and I folded last year as head of the LDF was for the LDF to sue the states of Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia for voter.
Yeah.
So that is what happens in a democracy. Justice can never be presumed. You never have the vaccine. You don't have a group of scientists in a room clapping and winning the Nobel Prize because they found the formula for the cocktail that's going to create the life-saving antiretroviral. You don't get that when you get justice, when you work on justice. You have to know that in our democracy, we do not take it for granted, and that's why the work we do is so much about institutions and people who are on the front lines, because they're going to need to be here now, and they're going to need to be here 50 years from now.
I want to ask you this final question in a time that I think all of us in our private conversations are describing our exhaustion, despair, whether it's with the Middle East or social justice or the lack of it at home, or Ukraine and Russia. The list goes on, or the climate change and all the rest. And yet this speech is innately optimistic. And I want to get a sense from you, Darren, where that finally comes from even now. Because I think it is common fare, despair. Despair is common fare. And understandable, maybe unforgivable, but understandable. Where does that optimism in you come from, either personally or in terms of principle?
Well, David, there is no doubt that I am an optimist. I'm a hopeless hopeaholic. There is no doubt. But, I am a black man in America. It is my view that in the history of the United States of America, have never been a people more hopeful and believing in the potential of the words in that Constitution than black Americans. And I don't say this I say this to say when I genuinely, I think about Frederick Douglass on this stage. Frederick Douglass knew in his lifetime he would never see justice. I think about Ida B. Wells, who was just trying to publish her newspaper, which talked about racism. And they burned her newspaper down. And yet, Ida B. Wells was a great patriot. She believed. I think about Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer was an uneducated black woman in Mississippi walking those dirt roads carrying an American flag, being beaten, being sterilized against her will, and she carried that flag everywhere she went. I think about Langston Hughes, a black, gay, closeted man like most of us were in the 1930s, living in Harlem, angry and dejected about how hard it was for him to get his poetry published, for him just to live with dignity. And he wrote, "Let America be America." And the first stanza, "Let America be America again." America never was America to me. He is voicing his rage at the hypocrisy, the language, and what he was living as a black man in Harlem in the 1930s. And yet, the last stanza, he writes, "But oh yes, someday America will be." Langston Hughes knew that America will be, that wasn't going to happen in his lifetime. And yet he writes these beautiful lines about the potential of America to be America. And so when I think about my circumstance, come on, the privilege that I live with, the way in which I am able to go about my daily life being treated with dignity when none of these people did. When I think about my grandmother, who worked for a family for 50 years, and the children in that family called her by her first name, and they called the neighbors Mrs. Jones. But she was known as Rosie to the children. And yet, she believed, even though on a daily basis, she was not provided the basic dignity of being called by her name, like white women of her age were. And so, shame on me if sitting here in my Ralph Lauren suit, talking to you, going home to my nice apartment, if I am in any way not hopeful, not a believer, not an optimist. Shame on me.
Darren Walker and all of you, thank you. Good night.